He really exemplifies the attempt at self-enrichment at the top of the state. So if you think one of the first things he does when he gets into Downing Street is try and find donors to pay for the re-wallpapering of Downing Street, which he and his wife expect to live in for 10 years. And then after leaving office, one of the first things he does is he flies to Venezuela to meet Nicolas Maduro, Venezuelan president, who's not recognized legitimate ruler by the UK, paid for by a hedge fund manager to meet Maduro. So Johnson exemplifies all the self-dealing by these people at the top of the state. Often it's legal because there are very few rules to stop it, but that helps the public kind of lose all trust and confidence in politicians, which is a crisis situation we find ourselves in now in Britain.
Chums author and FT journalist Simon Kuper is back with another polemic. His new book, Good Chaps, asks how British politics got more corrupt and what we should do about it. Simon Kuper, welcome back to the programme.
Thanks for having me.
Lovely to have you on again, Simon. Look, before we get into corruption and cures, tell me about the good chaps theory of British politics and civil service. What does it mean, the good chaps theory?
Well, it was formulated by the academic Peter Hennessy, and it's based on the idea that the way Britain is run is the presumption is that people at the top of the state are going to be good chaps. Typically went to public school and Oxbridge, and then they would have gone to war, come back from a world war and run the government, the BBC, the NHS. And you didn't have to make rules for these people to tell them not to be corrupt because they weren't going to be corrupt anyway. They were willing to die for Britain, so they weren't going to steal money from the state. So the heritage of that is that in Britain, we have very few rules binding the people at the top of the state. So the Tory ministers who left office this month, if tomorrow morning they want to go and work for Vladimir Putin, they can. There's not really any rules stopping them. So we have this good chaps theory, but the reality is that we have fewer good chaps than before, and chapesses. I use the term gender neutrally in the book. And so maybe we need rules to stop what seems to be growing corruption at the top of the state.
Well, okay, let's go back to the start and take that all in turn then. So the golden age of sensible British governments, of good chaps, you'd say, is what, basically post-war until the Thatcher era, right? I'm getting that's about right?
Yeah, that's about what I argue, that if you just look at the prime ministers from about 1940 until Thatcher becomes PM in 79, almost all of them, I think with the exception of Harold Wilson, had fought in one or other world war. So Ted Heath, much mocked, I think he got an MBE for bravery in the Normandy landings, or the Battle of Normandy. People like Macmillan, Eden, Attlee, they'd fought in World War I. They were good chaps. They never tried to enrich themselves out of their office. So yeah, that's really the heyday. And then from Thatcher, it starts to decline. Thatcher is the first prime minister who grew up after a world war. And she also thinks that getting rich is sort of holy. She admires that more than people serving the state.
Okay, well, we'll come back to Thatcher in a minute. I guess, so the obvious question is that period you're talking about, 39 to 79. Another way of looking at that is a great period of national decline. I mean, until perhaps recently, we've never gone through such a great period of national decline. We lost our empire. We became a much less wealthy nation. Various institutions sort of fell apart. And by the end of the 70s, as a nation, we were more or less in crisis, which would suggest that the good chaps, even if they were good chaps, perhaps weren't doing a terribly good job. Is that fair?
I think it's a bit unfair. I mean, it's a period of relative decline. So Britain goes from being a superpower in 1939 to very much not that, and under the International Monetary Fund's tutelage in 1979. So other countries catch up. Britain does get richer. So people who lived through the 50s and 60s saw their, quality of daily life improve immensely. I think it's true that the good chaps were not always the most professional runners of a state. And that wasn't really what was asked of them. They were not controlled in any way. So if you wanted to make a ridiculous decision, housing, wasn't really anyone to stop you. And if you'd been to the right public school, you were given that job. And so, yeah, it's not a period of extreme efficiency, but it's a period of quite low corruption. And in 1979, Britain is not a successful country, but it is a very equal country. I think income equality is the second in Europe after Sweden. So it's an immensely equal country. So these people, the public school boys, they haven't really sought to enrich themselves or their class at all. It's quite impressive in that way.
Yeah, that is interesting. And look, you write right at the start of the book, this isn't another book about Boris Johnson, but he does feature heavily. Why does he?
He really exemplifies the attempt at self-enrichment at the top of the state. So if you think one of the first things he does when he gets into Downing Street is try and find donors to pay for the re-wallpapering of Downing Street, which he and his wife expect to live in for 10 years. And then after leaving office, one of the first things he does is he flies to Venezuela to meet Nicolas Maduro, Venezuelan president, who's not recognized legitimate ruler by the UK, paid for by a hedge fund manager to meet Maduro. So Johnson exemplifies all the self-dealing by these people at the top of the state. Often it's legal because there are very few rules to stop it, but that helps the public kind of lose all trust and confidence in politicians, which is a crisis situation we find ourselves in now in Britain.
The scramble for contracts during COVID, which I mean, I'd imagine, I'm projecting and guessing, but I imagine was heavy in your mind when you thought of the concept
Yes.
for this book. There's obviously, like, there's an argument there that was just down to people being rubbish, right? That was down to a panicking government that wasn't very good at it, that turned to their mates first because their mates were the people they understood. Is that me being terribly naive?
It was my presumption as well, and an anti-corruption crusader told me that was terribly naive.
Right.
That I do think that there's a kind of rubbishness that often goes hand in hand with corruption and a kind of naivete about business people. So, okay, they were in the situation they needed masks and gowns in a hurry at the start of COVID. Britain didn't have enough, fair enough. Well, what they should have gone is gone to the suppliers the NHS always uses, because the NHS is always buying some masks and gowns, say, look, we need loads more in a hurry. How can we best get them? What you shouldn't do, what kind of any anti-corruption manual will tell you, is go to the donors to your party or let them call you. A donor calls excitedly and says, oh, I have a mask company. I can supply you with 1 million masks. And instead of saying, oh, that's brilliant, Joe, because you know each other, you're all on first name terms, you should say, well, actually, we would kind of prefer people who have been vetted by the NHS in the past for this. So they break all the rules. I mean, of course, you can't go through this usual bureaucratic hoops at a time of crisis. But the situation you end up in, that a huge amount of buying, billions of pounds of buying, is to donors, from donors to the Conservative Party, most of whom have no experience in providing protective gear. This looks like classic corruption. This is quite similar, I discovered in the research just for my book, with how Sierra Leone reacted during its Ebola pandemic. Again, the suppliers were people who were close to the ruling party. So
Mm.
it's not a completely British particularity. It really looks extremely bad. And it's one of the things Labour is now going to investigate with this kind of COVID corruption
Well,
czar they're appointing.
Well, let's turn to Labour. I mean, Keir Starmer talks a lot about the return to the politics of politicians of a return to service and notions of service running for election. But Labour has, I mean, Labour in the past had its own issues with cronyism. Very famously, the word became common currency, you know, during the Blair years, and Blair himself, his post-government work looks an awful lot like the sort of thing you're talking about with Boris Johnson. Is this just a sort of disease that crosses parties?
To some degree, yeah. And so in the book, I do talk a lot about Blair's role in undermining British trust in politicians. I mean, the sight of the most famous politicians in the country immediately after being PM going off and self-enriching encourages people to say they're only in it for themselves. I don't think most politicians are only in it for themselves, but you look at Blair, you look at Johnson, that would be what you conclude. So I don't think Labour is going to be immune to corruption. So I think we need rules which Labour is in a position to implement. And I do think that the temptations are going to rise. I think that the grifters who attach themselves to any ruling party are now in the process of attaching themselves to Labour. Because, of course, the party you wanted to corrupt, the party you wanted to buy favours from 2010 until last month, was the Conservative Party. Now all those people are turning to Labour. So it's a very risky situation. And it's an easy way for Labour to score some quick wins and regain public trust, because making anti-corruption legislation is free, whereas, say, making the trains run on time is expensive.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the idea of rules, which is of course at the heart of your book, does seem very important because presumably you wouldn't want to go back to good chaps because I mean the whole good chaps, the whole notion of good chaps. I mean, it's inherently elitist. It's inherently sort of one class ruling over the entirety of the country. Presumably, you'd regard a return to that state of affairs as being bad.
I think we need to democratize the good chap. So there are still these kind of public school good chaps in British public life who mean very well, who want to serve the state. Rory Stewart is the most famous example of that. Virginia Bottomley is another example. So these people come from the upper class, they believe deeply in public service, and they naturally assume their public service will be served at the top of the state because they were born at the top of the state. But to me, public service includes the garbage collector, the probation officer, the police officer, the teacher, all these millions of people around Britain who really just want to do good, serving the state, be paid a decent salary. They don't expect to become rich. And these people have had their salaries reduced in the last 15 years. They've been treated often with contempt and suspicion by politicians. So I think the public service ethos needs to be restored across the board, not just for the good chap class. But I do think we need rules, because once you get rules and people start to assume, the rules become norms, they become these unspoken norms.
Mm.
So you think, well, I'm not going to take money from a hedge fund manager to go and meet the unrecognized president of Venezuela, because that would just be wrong. There happens
Yeah.
to be a rule about it, and you need people to make these rules into these kind of norms that you follow unconsciously, unwittingly. Of course, you wouldn't do that. As they used to say 100 years ago, it's not cricket.